let us get started. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show a few slides, and a lot of this will be, today's session is going to be mostly an introduction. And if you do have questions, stop and ask. You can type them in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on everything as best I can. But really, the goal of this entire series, which will probably only be around 5 or 6 sessions, depending on how much we cover in our given amount of time. The main goals of this session are really to give you a better sense of how Hebrew works, and really just give you the confidence that I think is necessary to really engage in a language that we're not using all the time. So I'm going to show. All right, so here we go. So really the goal is to understand the development of Hebrew over time, to understand its core principles, and really just to make Hebrew make sense. I do want you to feel much more confident in reading and understanding it, as well as pronunciation. And we're going to talk a little bit today about pronunciation and different pronunciation traditions. And I'm also going to really hope that every session you have some kind of an aha moment. So really a moment in every session where you're learning something that you haven't learned before. So this entire series is pretty much, I know we usually say everything is for everyone. Generally speaking, in terms of Hebrew level, this class is for everyone. So people who have never read a single letter in Hebrew to people who grew up speaking it fluently, or even people who have studied it. I'm really hoping that this series gives you something new that you haven't discovered before. This is going to require a lot of curiosity. So something, I'm going to pull the slides off for a second. Something that you should just know about me is that I am not a fan of short answers. And we're going to tackle a question in about 5 minutes. And you're going to see that a very, very simple sounding question really has a much longer, much deeper answer. And we might not have even technically answer that question, but we're going to learn a lot along the way. So really having a lot of curiosity in this class is going to be important. And the other thing that I want to keep in mind is that, you're going to need to have an open mind. You really are going to need to be willing to learn and to challenge, both challenge what you already know and also challenge what I'm saying. So especially in these first 2 sessions, we're talking about a lot of conjecture. So we're going to start talking about how people have tried to recreate older versions of Hebrew, what it looked like, what it sounded like, what it meant. And some of that is going to be really educated guesswork, essentially, from academics. We have been making a lot of, I haven't done any of the research. Academic scholars have been making a lot of progress over the last 100 years on understanding Hebrew. But for the most part, everything that I'm going to show you is going to have solid evidence. But some of it is going to be conjectural, so certainly you can challenge it. So I do want to just show you that, you know what, here, I'm going to finish the introduction and then we'll dive in. So one of the big questions that I get as I teach courses like this is, who the hell are you? And I think that's a really good question. In terms of qualifications, I don't have any. I'm not a rabbi. I'm not a linguist. I don't even have a bachelor's degree. I'm just a person who knows this stuff. And I have about 8 years of experience teaching Hebrew to students of all levels, to children, to adults. I grew up in a Hebrew-speaking household, so that was modern Hebrew. I also have 12 years of formal Jewish education, where I also learned biblical and rabbinic Hebrew. We're going to talk about those developments in a bit. And generally speaking, by teaching this, I've learned different ways of making Hebrew make the most sense. Now, something that I struggled with as a student, and this is a cardinal sin that I promise you we will not make in this class, is throughout most of my Hebrew learning, my formal Hebrew learning, I would ask the question of why, right? So I would be learning verb constructs. I would be learning about different prefixes and suffixes, and I would say, why? Why is it this way? Why do I see this vowel under this letter and then a different vowel under the next letter, but they both make the same sound? Why can't I just use the same vowel in both places? I would ask all of these why questions, and usually the answer that I would get was kachaze, that's the way it is. Basically, teachers were saying just memorize it and deal with it. And some people talk about that as prescriptive. And what I am hoping to get to is really answering that why kind of a more descriptive way. The beautiful thing about Hebrew, and I'm going to stress this a lot in this session, is that Hebrew is an incredibly logical language. It's one of the easiest. I know it's foreign and a lot of people don't speak it in our community, but it's one of the easiest languages to learn because it makes so much sense. And there are a lot of reasons why it makes sense that we're going to touch on today. One of the reasons that it makes so much sense is that it is a very, very old language. The reason that that's helpful is that there are very, very few instances of totally foreign words that have made their way into early Hebrew. Hebrew being an old language, there also wasn't a lot of travel going on. And so the other languages that Hebrew speakers encountered had very, very similar sounds, sentence structures, verb constructs, things like that. So Hebrew, as opposed to English, is a very, very neat and tidy language. And then the other reason that we're really going to focus on today, the other reason why Hebrew is such a logical language, especially when we talk about biblical Hebrew or ancient Hebrew, is because the Hebrew alphabet is one of the earliest alphabets that we have in the written record. And so we're going to talk about how the Phoenicians kind of developed that alphabet, how the Greeks adopted it, how the ancient Israelites adopted it. But really what's nice about Hebrew is that it's very, very clean, very structured because it's ancient. And then the last thing that we're going to touch on in a bit is the other reason why biblical Hebrew is so neat and tidy. And that's because at a pretty early stage, it stopped being spoken. And so after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Hebrew really stopped being spoken as a language. And so it was preserved in the written record, and it was recited orally, but very formally. And it was only around the year 1000 that people really started to very, very, in a beautifully structured way, help us understand how Hebrew works and break it down in pronunciation. And we're going to talk about them. They're called the Masoretes, and we're going to talk about the Tiberians in that sense. So the thing to just keep in mind is that Hebrew isn't as messy as other languages because it's very, very old. The languages that it was encountering early on were very, very similar. And at a stage where most languages started to really diverge and get a little hazy, Hebrew stopped being spoken, which meant that it was really just preserved in the written record. So it's very, very clean, very neat, very tidy. So let's just, and then one disclaimer, or a few disclaimers that I think are important, is that over the course of this series, I am going to say things that are going to be challenging to a traditional Jewish ear. So we're going to talk about the development of the Hebrew language that is very closely tied into a critical study of the Bible, which can be a little bit challenging for people. So one of the things that we're going to talk about, and I just want to be clear, I'm not telling anyone what they should or shouldn't believe, but it is important to go into this study recognizing that the perspective that I am bringing to the table is one where the Bible, as we have recorded today, is not a perfect book. And that's going to be really important because we're going to talk about how the Bible has typos, and how the Masoretes, these scribal schools, really noted that and helped us understand what Hebrew looked like, sounded like. The transition through time of Hebrew is really tied into that written record, which includes the Bible. So just as a heads up, we're going to say some stuff that might challenge a traditional Jewish ear. So let's just start with a bad question. And I know some of you might have been taught in school that there's no such thing as a bad question. I disagree. When I say a bad question, what I mean by a bad question is a question that doesn't really have a useful answer to it. So when people ask how many letters are there in the Hebrew alphabet, you could give a whole number of answers that would technically be correct, right? You could say there are 22 or 23. Say there are 25, 27, 29, whatever you wanted to say, you could really back up a lot of answers to this question. The other reason that I think this is a bad question, how many letters are there, is because the answer to that question, whatever number you come to, has never been useful to me. And I'm just curious, I'm going to pause here to ask, have you ever benefited from knowing how many letters there are, let's say, in the English alphabet? I'm going to move into gallery mode so I can see everyone. Right? Just like shake your head or nod or, right? Never been useful, right? People ask me this all the time. It's in trivia questions all the time, how many letters are in the Hebrew alphabet, and it drives me nuts. It has never, ever, ever been useful to me to know that. Now, if I wanted to answer the question of how many letters are there in the English alphabet, you would have to sit here and watch me count A, B, C, D, and and it's never been useful. The only time that I found that number of letters in an alphabet useful actually has to do with the Greek alphabet. It's useful to know that the Greek alphabet had 24 letters. Why was it useful to know that the Greek alphabet had 24 letters? Because that number, 24, holds a really interesting meaning. So does anyone know? I'm going to take myself off of Spotlight here so I can see everyone's faces. Does anyone know how many letters? I'm sorry. Does anyone know how many books there are in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible? And you can unmute yourself and just kind of yell it out.
I thought 43, but I may be wrong.
Okay, so you're right that there are going to be a number of answers to this question. But any other thoughts? How many books there are in the Bible? Kind of, there's a traditional number that exists in a lot of Jewish texts. Okay, so in the Tanakh, usually people say there are 24 books of the Bible, right? 24 books of the Bible. Now, to Michael's point, in order to get to that, you really have to do some mental gymnastics here, right? So you've got to combine all of the minor prophets into one. You have to combine Ezra and Nehemiah. You have to combine the books of Chronicles. You have to divide the book of Chronicles into two. You have to divide Samuel into two, Kings into two. So you're doing a lot of constricting, you're adding and subtracting. You're really trying to get to the number 24. The number 24, in terms of how many books of the Bible, even predates the canonization of the Bible. So there were still books in the Bible that hadn't made it into the Bible after the point at which Jewish texts were already saying there are 24 books of the Bible. Now, why is that? Why am I harping on this? The most likely answer that I found as to why we say that there are 24 books in the Bible is because there are 24 letters in the Greek alphabet. So I am not a student of Greek literature. I just happen to know that Homer's, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, they also have 24 books in them, right? And the point of that is if you are walking around as an educated person in the ancient world and you know that there are 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, the number 24 means all-encompassing, A to Z, right? And so your holy book or your important pieces of literature, if they're supposed to be meaningful in every area of your life, you're going to have 24 of them, okay? This, if people want a Jewish text, in the Talmud, there's a beautiful story about two rabbis that would disagree with each other all the time. It was Rabbi Yochanan and the Reish Lakish. And these two rabbis, they fought all the time. There was a moment where Rabbi Yochanan, who was also Reish Lakish's teacher, insulted him so badly that the Talmud says that the Reish Lakish got sick and died. And so Rabbi Yochanan now doesn't have a study partner, and he's going around, he's like, I need someone. And so they keep throwing these yes men at him, right? They keep throwing new students at him who just agree with everything that he says, Rabbi Yochanan ends up going nuts, ultimately dies. But one of the things that I think is important is that when he talks about the value of when Rabbi Yochanan talks about the value of the Reish Lakish, what does he say? The Talmud tells us that it says that for every point I make, the Reish Lakish had 24 counterpoints, 24 arguments, right? So that number means something, right? That number is he challenged me A to Z, right? He challenged me from alpha to omega or whatever, right? So start to finish, he did that. So 24, the only number that's ever been useful for me in the world of knowing how many letters there are in an alphabet is the Greek alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet, going back to the bad question that we have, right? The Hebrew alphabet, some people said there are 27. If you were to sing the Aleph Bet song, okay? Aleph Bet, right? Depending on when you learned that song and from whom you learned it, you might actually get to a different number, right? So if you went to, let's say, a Ashkenazi Orthodox school, you might have ended that song shin, sin, taf, and sav, right? You would have two of the final letters doubled up. If you learned from a Sephardic teacher or from like a modern Israeli, you would just end shin, sin, tav, done, right? One less letter that you've learned. So I really want to talk about not getting to an answer to that question, not trying to answer what, again, I think is a bad question. The bad question being, how many letters are there? I want to get into the reason that the answer to this question is really going to take us to the end of our time in this session. So in order to understand this, we have to know a couple of principles about the history of language. The first principle that's really important is that language was spoken first and then it was written. Okay, this is incredibly important for Hebrew. Here's the reason that it's incredibly important for Hebrew. If you are speaking a language and then you start putting symbols onto those sounds, does it make any sense to have two symbols that make the exact same sound? No, right? How would you know, right? If you are hearing a sound and then you put a symbol on it, then every unique sound would have a distinct symbol. So in the Hebrew alphabet nowadays, right? People ask me this question all the time, and here we can answer it. People say, Yoni, why is there a tet and a tav, right? They make the same sound. Why is there a chet and a chaf? They make the same sound. Why is there a kuf and a kaf? They make the same sound, right? And why does it matter if I spell it differently, right? So the matter if it spells differently, we're going to get to at the end of the session when we talk about roots. But the beginning is the answer to that question of why are there two letters that make the same sound, the vet and the vav, for instance, is because originally they didn't. Originally they didn't, okay? I'll give you one good example. Originally, the vav was a wow. Originally, the vav was a wow. We know this for a number of reasons. One of them is that Arabic still has this, okay? Arabic still has the wow sound. The wow is used in Hebrew also as a vowel because it kind of sounds like one, right? The wow, right? You got like an ow, ooh sound, right? And so the vav is used as a vowel sometimes and not just as a consonant. The vav is used as a vowel that means o or u. Wow. Cool. Okay. So you have different letters that make different sounds initially. Over time, our ears kind of lost it. Okay. So a lot of sounds in a lot of languages, not just in Hebrew, a lot of sounds start to blend together. Okay. So this, for instance, that the hey, right, which is a very open in the back of your mouth. And in a moment, we're going to start playing with sounds. But the hey sound that comes through like really nice and breathy, very, very similar to the original het. Okay, the het was like an open guttural in the back. Mizrahi Sephardi communities still make that sound of the het. And then you have the hard chaf, the hard chaf. It's moving. Do it with me. Put yourself on mute and make these sounds with me. Make that chaf sound, the ch sound. You can feel it. It's a little further up. You can feel it kind of in like the back of the roof of your mouth. Ch, right? You can hear that roll. Okay. Now, that sound is also very similar to another letter that we no longer pronounce in English in this way, which was that gimel sound is going to make a different sound with and without a dot in it. Without it, it was a rimmel. Okay. R. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. All right. But just keep in mind that the r and the h and the ch, they're all very, very similar. They're all made in a very similar part of the mouth with different amounts of with different articulation, slightly different vocal quality and airflow. Okay, so all of these sounds though are very, very similar. Do it with the T and the S, right? T, S, T, S. Very, very similar. And now do it with a soft TH, like thank you. And then this, like a hard one, right? T, S, th, Z. These are all very, very similar sounds. And so a lot of these letters that initially represented different sounds, they started to morph into one another, started to change. And depending on where Jews moved throughout the world, we were influenced, their ears were influenced by the languages that we heard. And so that's why you have, let's say, a very, very different sound of Hebrew if you are a Yemenite Jew from if you're a German Jew, from if you're a Moroccan Jew. You're going to hear different sounds. And an American Jew, right? In America, the resh turned into an R. The R is a very, very difficult sound to make, right? The fact that English has an R shows that the late development of the English. The R is a very, very complex sound to make in your mouth. Your tongue is doing like 4 different things, right? Just make that R sound and notice what your tongue is doing. It's a very, very difficult sound. It is not surprising that children struggle so much with this R sound. It's a very, very hard sound to make. That sound did not exist in ancient Hebrew, but because English has this R sound, the R turned into an R, right? It was just a sound that we were used to. You do have, in Arabic, you have a Ra, which also rolls, but that's a trill. It's with the tongue in the front of your mouth. And it sounds very similar to what like the Tiberians described that R, which was a roll in the back of the tongue. Or sorry, a roll in the back of the throat, not so much in the tongue. So just to keep in mind, when people say like, why are there all of these letters that make the same sound? The answer is originally they didn't. Over time, those sounds developed. Some of them shifted and moved to different letters. And it will be significant why that is the case. So I want to go back to this slide. Okay, so first thing that we talked about was that the language was spoken first, then written. The way that this worked was that first we had pictures for objects. Okay, so think of like hieroglyphics, right? When language started to be written, when concepts started to be drawn, you would essentially draw, if you were talking about a house, you didn't spell that out, you just drew a house, right? If you're talking about a cow, you just drew a cow. Okay, so pictures for objects. Then, like in cuneiform, we start seeing pictures for sounds or for syllables. So you started to take the symbol that made a famous word, and you would take the sound, the first sound of that concept or of that object, and that became the symbol that you used for that sound. And then we got the alphabets. Okay, alphabets were a little bit more specific. So cuneiform had, a totally a language that was written down entirely in pictures. You had to memorize like thousands of images to know what someone was talking about. When you got to these syllables that were, these generalized sounds and pictures, you had a few hundreds, maybe like in the low 1 to 2,000 images that you had to memorize. But with alphabets, we start getting these very, very specific sounds. Now, the thing that's important is to understand how the Hebrew alphabet developed. So see if you can maybe zoom in on that screen. The important thing to note, let me see if I can make this bigger. I might not. Okay, but the important thing to note, if you look at the kind of the right half of this, we have here what's known as the Phoenician alphabet. This is the alphabet that was used by the very, very early Hebrew writers. Okay, now this is a consonantal alphabet. There are only consonants, there are no vowels. It was the Greeks who put vowels in. Okay, but we start to get writing. And we've seen inscriptions from way before the time of the Bible. We start seeing inscriptions that are using this alphabet. So a lot of Hebrew was written in this alphabet. In fact, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them are written entirely in an alphabet that looks very, very similar to this, much more so than what the current Hebrew alphabet looks like. So this is the Hebrew alphabet develops over time. Eventually, we get to this. And this goes back to your question of how many letters are there in the Hebrew alphabet, right? It depends on how you count them. Do you count the shin and the sin as 2 different letters? The shin and the sin are the kind of the last few there. Do you count those as totally different letters, or are they the same? They have kind of the same image. One has a dot on the right, one has a dot on the left. Okay, you've got like the beged kefet letters. That's bet gimel daled kaf pe tav. And the question is, like if the letter makes a different sound depending on whether or not there's a dot in it, do you count that as its own letter? It's a good question. And then you have these in the bottom row, these final letters, these sofit letters. So now I just want to share one thing that most people might not realize is that originally there were only sofit letters. Originally, there were only the final versions of the kaf, the nun, the pei, and the tzadi. We're going to skip the mem for a second, okay? But originally, there were just that bottom row there. Now, so you might ask, why is there a final sofit, like final and sofit mean the same thing. Sofit means final in Hebrew. Why are there sofit letters and then like regular letters? It's a great question. Does anyone have a guess? Does anyone have an idea?
I can hazard something. It's probably not right, but
Go for it.
You couldn't just go to Amazon and order 10,000 sheets of paper. So paper would have been precious, and it would be a way to squish the words together and know when one word was ending and one was starting.
Okay, good. So there is definitely an element of these sofit letters that shows not necessarily punctuation, but the end of a word versus the start of a word. That's certainly a part of it. But let me show you something. Let me see if this will work. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I want to see if I can draw something for you. And really what I'm trying to show here we go. Let's see if this works. What I want to show here is why the sofit letters, which was the original for all of these, why the sofit letters, yes? Let's see. Nope. Okay, if this isn't working, that's okay. I can do it differently. All right, all the tech savviness in the world, nothing. Here we go. So we're gonna do this the old-fashioned way. All right, I'll write on this thing. Okay, yes?
Sometimes old school is the best school.
Absolutely, although now you have to see my handwriting. Okay, so here we go. So we initially had sofit letters. Let's take the pei as an example. The pei, this is the pei sofit. Can you see that, or is it too far away?
I can see it fine, but I'm on a big monitor.
Okay, so this was the pei. The problem with the pei is that it has this very long descender, right? It has a tail that comes down into the next line. And this is very disruptive to a scribe. And so in order to limit the number of descenders that you had here, they just bent the descender onto the line. So the pei most often became this. Right? Is it close enough for people to see? I wish I had a thicker marker. Okay, so the pei was this sofit letter with the long descender, and then we bent it and it became this, right? Same thing, let's do the tzadi. I'm gonna try to get a better angle here to write. The tzadi sofit was originally like this, right? The tzadi was this. That became, again, kind of a problem for the line below. And so you bent it, and this became the tzadi, right? You could do the same thing with the nun. The nun was just kind of like a very long descender here. That got in the way, so you bent it. And the nun is like this. The kaf and the chaf are the same. Now, thank you, whiteboard. Now, the thing is that the mem probably switched off between the mem and the mem sofit. So you might say, well, the mem doesn't work that way, right? The mem doesn't have a descender. So the mem sofit, you don't need a descender, or you don't need to curb that descender, right? The mem actually existed interchangeably, and this is preserved in the Bible. There are still biblical verses that include a mem sofit in the middle of a word. It wasn't a mistake. It was just a really old text, and they kind of chose between the two. Okay, and even the Talmud talks about this development between the Sofit letters. The Talmud notes with a very fantastical story, but the Talmud notes that originally you had Sofit letters, and then that got morphed into these like shorter letters that were easier to fit on a line. So even the Talmud is aware of this. So far, I haven't said anything too offensive. Anytime I cite like the Talmud, it's because I'm worried that I'm saying something a little nuts and I'm trying to back it up with the rabbi. We'll talk about that at the end. I do that one more time. So that's important to note. The other thing that's important to note is that initially there was only the hard sound of these letters. Okay, so I want to talk about these 6 letters, the Beged Kefet letters. I'm going to show you that slide one more time. The Beged Kefet letters, that's just like an acronym, so to speak, for the Bet, Gimel, Daled, Kaf, Pe, Tav. Okay, so that's that middle row. Originally, now the original text, like the biblical text, all of the inscriptions that we have, there were no dots. Okay, there were no dots, there were no vowel signs. That comes around 1000 CE. So that's a very late introduction. Originally, these sounds only made the hard sounds. Okay, so there was only a bet, there was no vet. There was only a kaf, there was no chaf. There was only a pe, there was no fe. Okay, now you might say, well, what's the deal with this gimel and the daled? Like, what's the deal there? So with all of these letters, and these are all one letter, okay, the bet and the vet are the exact same letter. At a certain point in history, they became getting vocalized differently depending on where that letter fell in the syllable. Okay, and next week we're going to talk about vowels and syllables, but just bear with me for now. Depending on where in the word the sound appears, it changes, it morphs. Okay, so if it's at the beginning of a word or beginning of a syllable, you get the hard sound. So for instance, right, the first letter or the first word of the Hebrew Bible, of the Tanakh, Genesis 1, is Bereshit. Okay, it's a bet, a hard B, not a V. Why? Because the sound is just really easy to make if it's the beginning of a syllable. If it comes at the end of a syllable, it turns into a V. Okay, and do it with your mouth. So now I want everyone to play again with the sounds. Do it with your mouth. The B and the V. It's a labial. Okay, so you're using your lips for both. One is a stop, and the other lets air flow. Okay, so take a moment to play with weird sounds. B, V. Okay, the sounds coming, the articulation is the exact same. It's your lips hitting each other, but with the V, it flows. We do this in English all the time. We sounds morph depending on where they are in the word, depending on what word preceded it, right? We're constantly doing this with our letters, right? So I might say, I wanted to take a shortcut. Shortcut. Where's that first T, right? If I wanted to be really precise, I would say I took a shortcut, right? But usually it's like I took a shortcut, right? You hear the second T more prominently than the first, right? Depending on where it is. So the same thing happened with that tav, okay? The last letter, the ta, was a very soft th when it was not at the beginning of a word. So f, t, f, right? Your tongue's kind of like right behind your front teeth. F, air is going through, okay? This, by the way, is where we get words like Shabbos, Shabbos, right? Shabbat, right? That tav is at the end. It does not have a dot in it. If you look at it in the Bible, it does not have a dot in the top, right? Shabbat, Shabbat. Now, that turned into an S in some parts of the world. And so the Ashkenazi community says Shabbos, right? Shabbos. This happens all the time, right? By the way, the ayin, okay, the ayin, which in most of our circles, right, in the Ashkenazi circle, sounds just like the Aleph, a very open ah. The ayin was much more guttural. It was a harder sound. Now we see this in the way that Hebrew words are transliterated into English. So I'll give you two city names that are biblical, Azza and Amorah. Okay, the first one is Gaza. Azza is Gaza when it was translated into into the Greek. Okay, so Azza became Gaza, and Amorah became Gomorrah, like Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, they're an ayin, and you're like, how do you get a G from an ayin, right? A gimel makes a G sound. I don't understand where you get Gaza from the word Aza, right? But nowadays, when Ashkenazi Jews in particular say the ayin, it sounds very, very open. Whereas biblically, it was a very, very hard sound, the ayin, right? Almost like making a g sound. Okay, so the Aza turned into Gaza. Okay, so we see that the sounds morph, they change. The sounds that we use to speak these letters have changed over time. Now, some of you might be saying, okay, this, by the way, is like something that I get really self-conscious about, right? Yoni, when I'm speaking Hebrew, I go to Israel and everyone laughs at me because they say, you sound like you're speaking English. You're speaking with such a thick American accent. Like I'm so, whatever, right? I'm reading Torah and someone has a really nice accent and I don't have a nice accent. Okay. So this is something that I'm a very snobby person when it comes to Hebrew. When it comes to pronunciation though, when it comes to accent, I'm not snobby. Okay, so long as your accent is consistent, so long as your pronunciation is consistent, I'm not snobby. The reason for that is because there was always diversity in how Hebrew was pronounced, always, even in the time of the Bible. Even in the time of the Bible, different people in the land of Israel spoke Hebrew with a different accent. Some letters made one sound in one community, they made other sounds in other communities. So this, just because we're streaming live on YouTube and Facebook, I was going to show a clip from the West Wing, but I didn't want the video to get taken down for copyright infringement, so I'm not. But Martin Sheen does a great job of explaining this, right? He explains the word Shibboleth. The word Shibboleth comes from the book of Judges, Shibboleth. And the thing that happened here with Shibboleth was that different groups of Israelites pronounced different letters or the same letter in different ways. And so this comes from the book of Judges. It says that the Israelites from Gilad, they held the fords of the Jordan against those from Ephraim. And when any fugitive from Ephraim said, let me cross the Jordan River, the men of Gilad would ask him, are you from Ephraim, right? So they're at war. You got to know who can pass and who can't. So they said, are you from Ephraim? If they said no, if they denied it, they would say to him, then say the word Shibboleth. But he wouldn't say Shibboleth, he would say Siboleth. Like the shin morphed into a sin, right? The sh sound, if you were from Ephraim, actually made a s, a softer s sound. So not being able to pronounce it correctly, they would seize him and kill him, right? They would know that he wasn't one of us because his accent was different. This also, by the way, comes in the prophet Amos. The prophet Amos was a southern prophet who preached in the north, and he's very, very well known for his incredible wordplay. One of the things that you have to understand to fully appreciate his wordplay is that he knew that people in the north pronounced words differently from the south. And so if you recognize that, you notice there's an extra level of punetry. I don't know if that's a word, right? His puns only worked in the north because of the way, right? So if you look at his conflation of the word kites and kates, right? The vowels had shifted in the north from the south. And so he knew that those two words actually sounded the same. Similar to when he uses a phrase like anach and anochi, Okay, so Anach means tin, like the metal, and there are all these weird lines that make no sense. God is putting tin places, right? Or God is placing tin. It's like a very weird phrase that doesn't make sense to us. But if you knew from the northern vowel system, Anochi sounds like Anach, and so really it's not tin. It's saying God is saying I am here. Okay, so there are all these weird puns that you get, but the important thing to note is that even in the time of the Bible, you had diversity in pronunciation, you had diversity in accent. Now, the Hebrew that we have today, that we speak today, modern Hebrew, is a beautiful melting of all of these different pronunciations. Okay, so generally, if you go to Israel, you'll hear a lot of kind of the standard is a blend between Ashkenazi and Sephardi traditions. We make certain sounds, certain vowel sounds that are very similar in the Ashkenazi tradition, some consonant sounds that are very similar in the Sephardi tradition. It's kind of this blending of all of these different sounds. Obviously, an American accent speaking Hebrew uses American vowel sounds in a way that's very different from an Israeli. So we're going to play with vowels just for a second. We'll deal more with it next week. But the O sound, the O vowel in Hebrew isn't as rounded as the O sound in English. And that's something that you would hear an Israeli say, right? Like the word for food would be ochel, not ochel, right? O versus O. Okay, the length of the vowel is different. It kind of turns into a bit of a diphthong in English, and you get more rounding at the mouth. So the vowel sounds, even in biblical times, change depending on where you were living in Israel, and that's true today, even across the world. So I would just say, in terms of pronunciation and accent, don't feel bad if like you think your accent is a little off. There's no such thing as an off accent. The other thing I'll say is that the Torah vocalization system that we have, this is like the trope sounds that, or the trope marks that you see, the cantillation marks that you see in the Bible, the vowels that you see, the dots in the bet versus the vet, like all of those dots and dashes and all those things. That system was made by this family of Tiberian Masoretes. Masoretes are like traditionalists. They're scribes that were operating for hundreds of years trying to meticulously write down the Bible and preserve it. There was one family of Masoretes who lived in Tiberias near the Sea of Galilee, and they were called the Ben Asher family. And for hundreds of years, they created a system of vocalization. That's what we use. Those are the vowels that we use. Those are the trope marks that we use to read. These people, the Masoretes, they're so important, and I feel like they also would be terrible at a dinner party, right? These, I think of them, they were so meticulous. They were like the teacher that I had who, I really had to go to the bathroom, and I would say, can I go to the bathroom? And she would say, I don't know, can you? And I would say, well, I'm going to need to. I don't know, can you? I would say, can I? And I didn't know what was going on. And then all of a sudden someone like elbows me and says, just say, may I? And I said, may I? And she said, sure. Why didn't you ask before? And then I did ask, right? Those were the Masoretes, right? The Masoretes were like the pain in the ass, but they were so meticulous. And the reason that we have these beautiful codices, these beautiful copies of the complete biblical text, is because they were so precise. Every single letter that they copied by hand was identical over hundreds of years. They did this amazing thing. The thing that's sad about them is that their vocalization system, their vowels and all that stuff, that was preserved in the written record, but the actual sounds that they were representing are not preserved. So next week, we'll talk about vowels. We use their vowels. You have like the segol, it's like 3 dots, it makes an S sound. That's not the sound that it makes when they wrote it down, right? The kametz, right? Like the T, didn't make an ah sound. It made an o sound, right? And so the sounds, that, by the way, was preserved by the Ashkenazi Jews. And that's also why Shabbos sounds like Shabbos, because the first ah is just a horizontal line that made an ah sound. And the T used to always make an o sound. So Shabbos, right? Shabbos. Okay. Anyway, so the Masoretes were these people, they wrote everything down meticulously. Now, what they also did when they wrote manuscripts was they made scribal notes in the margins. for the traditional ear, I apologize, even the Bible has typos. And the Masoretes had this rule that every single time you wrote the Bible, it had to be identical. It had to be perfect. That means that you also had to include the typos. I think of them as, I'm going to use a sports reference here. The funniest thing, my favorite thing that I see when I watch football, it makes no sense to me, is when someone's running with the ball, they get tackled, bodies everywhere. They're right very, very close to the first down marker. They need to get to that 10 yards, that first down marker. You have no idea where the ball is, right? The ball is like covered up in someone's body and another body, and you have no idea where the ball is. The referee takes the ball and eyeballs it. He just puts it somewhere. And then, these are the Masoretes, this family. Then you have these two guys come out with sticks. And the sticks are exactly 10 yards. And they measure to the millimeter the ball that's been eyeballed by some guy who didn't see it, right? Like some referee who is like kind of watching it guesses where he thinks the ball is, but then they bring out the tape measure and they're like, oh, you just barely missed it. And sometimes it's like by a hair and they're like, sorry, you missed it, right? Those are the Masoretes. They meticulously wrote everything down, but even they didn't know what the Bible sounded like 1,000 years before them. Okay, so like I said before, I just want to give you a little bit of the timeline. The Hebrew language was originally spoken. Then it was written, right, borrowing the Phoenician alphabet. Then the Aramaic script kind of got in. That's very close to what we know today. The script changed in the way that it looked. The sounds were always evolving, but after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Hebrew stops being spoken. And so different communities are just reading it in different ways. And so the original vocalization is lost. The Tiberians, this Tiberian Masoretic family, they are like, it's so hard. We have a consonantal text. There are no vowels in here. It's very difficult to pronounce things correctly. We're going to come up with a vowel system that will imitate the sounds that we hear. They were guessing, right? The Masoretes, we now know what generally speaking, we know what their Hebrew sounded like. In their time, the Vav made a V sound, right? They had no concept of that being a W. And so we still see that these Masoretes, they were like very carefully measuring an approximation. And then what they ended up actually notating was kind of lost. We know generally what their Hebrew sounded like based on listening to similar languages over time. So for instance, the Aramaic, Arabic, we have descriptions, which is kind of cool. In the Cairo Geniza, we found people were writing down descriptions of what these sounds made. So nowadays we use like the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, and that very precisely describes sounds. In the old time, they didn't have that, but they still wrote down what different sounds sounded like. And so we kind of know somewhat of a reconstruction of what the Tiberians were speaking. We have no idea exactly how biblical Hebrew sounded, but it did change over time. So I just want to take a quick pause here for questions, because we have about 10 minutes left, and I just want to get to one more. I'm going to hint to one more thing, but we'll stop here. Are there any questions that anyone has on what I've said so far? Something that you didn't like, something that you disagree with, something that I might have misspoken? The coffee just kind of runs through me. Okay, so I want to pause here and show you something that I think is cool, which probably means that it isn't, but I think it's cool. And that is the changing of the font or the script itself. So, okay, the Phoenicians, right? They come up with this beautiful alphabet, and the Greeks decide to adopt the alphabet. But the Greeks, one of the things that the Greeks did two big things. One is that they added vowels. Okay, so there were sounds that we made in like biblical Hebrew that were lost in Greek, but they still had those letters. They still had those symbols, and so they moved them over to be vowels. They were like, we need vowels, and so they took these other letters, they made them vowels. Hebrew then copied that. Okay, so there are a few letters. There are 4 letters. You can call them ahoy. Okay, it's the Aleph, Hey, Vav, Yud, ahoy, right? The ahoy letters, those function sometimes as vowels in Hebrew, okay? For instance, the word bo, bet aleph, without a vowel, right? The aleph functions as the o vowel, right? The hey for a while functioned as the o vowel, and then it changed to meaning a. You know that in ancient names like Shlomo, Solomon, Shlomo ends with a hey. That originally was an o. You use the hey to indicate the vowel o. Same thing with Shiloh, the city Shiloh, where the tabernacle was kept for a while. But over time, the hey meant a, right? And the yud made an e or an a sound. Okay, so we took from the Greeks. We saw, hey, you took all these letters that like aren't that important. You made them vowels. We're going to double up. We're going to do that too. But what I think is cool is that the original Aleph, I just want to, as a good illustration of what I've been talking about the development of Hebrew. The original Aleph looked like this. This is like the Phoenician. Okay, this was the original Aleph. The word Aleph means ox. Look down on this, the ox's head, right? The first alphabet, the first letter of the alphabet, the ox's head, right? So this was an ox, this was an aleph. Now, one of the second thing that the Greeks did was not only did they add vowels, they started switching, they started writing left to right. And so Hebrew is written right to left. It confuses a lot of people. Ancient Greek, they started writing left to right. And so these letters rotated. And that became the alpha. Okay. We can do this all day, but I'll give you one more, right? So the original hey, right? The hey in we call it Paleo Hebrew. It's exactly the same as Phoenician. It's just like the ancient Hebrew. The hey looks like this. Okay, this was the hey. And then it rotated. And again, that sound was kind of like it's like a nothing sound. So the Greeks turned it into a vowel. And it became the E, right? And if you look at the alphabet, you see these like match up in order, right? Same thing with that kaf, the Proto or the Paleo Hebrew, the Phoenician kaf was like this. Kaf gets rotated, so it turns into the K sound. Remember how I said that originally the Sophite letters, those final letters with the descenders, were the original? This was the kaf. It had a descender, right? The mem had a descender, right? The mem comes from the word mayim, water, right? So it's a very basic word that starts with the m sound. Again, in the way that Hebrew developed, the way that the language developed, mayim is a very common word. Water is a very common word. It starts with the m sound. And so they said, we're going to take the symbol that means water. We're going to make it represent m. This turned into M, as we can, kind of easily see. This, I'm going to warn anyone again. I'm going to say something that's going to be offensive, but I'm going to back it up with a rabbi. So this is really important. There's a verse that every Jewish person who prays knows from the Bible, and it's a typo. Okay, now I'm not arguing that we should change this. I'm just saying. In the book of Ezekiel, and we hear this in the Kedusha. It's been used in the Kedusha in the middle of the Amidah. Okay, in the book of Ezekiel, there's this beautiful line that talks about Baruch Kevod Adonai Mimkomo, right? This is what's viewed as like the angels yell out, blessed is the glory of God in its place. Baruch Kevod Adonai Mimkomo. Okay. This was the Proto or the Paleo Hebrew letter for the mem, and this was for at the stage at which we think this happened. This was that kaf. Okay. Now, if you look at it, let me see if I can pull it up real quickly. If you look at the Hebrew line in Ezekiel, I should have pulled this up before. I apologize. If you look at the line in Ezekiel, it doesn't really make sense. Okay, so we have. Apologize for taking up all this time. All right. I'm blanking on it right now. I think it's in Ezekiel 3. But either way, so this line, though, if you switch it to a mem, it's this word, berom. And this means lifted. The line in Ezekiel, I'll show it to you next week when I get organized. The book of Ezekiel uses this word always to describe when God's chariot, or the presence of God, lifts off of the ground. And so the book of Ezekiel talks about this roaring sound, this huge sound like wings flapping. And it describes the sound in the Masoretic text, in the text of the Bible that we have today. It says, Baruch kevod Adonai minkomo, right? There's this massive sound, and you have to kind of like do some mental gymnastics to fit the translation. It's like the massive sound was saying, praised is God's glory as from his place, right? And so that's how it was used in liturgy, right? It's used to say in the Kedusha, we call out, the angels scream out your name, Baruch kavod Adonai minkomo, right? Blessed, praised is the glory of God as it leaves its place. And that was for a very long time the translation. In the 1880s, I think, Rabbi Samuel David Lozado, the Shadal. I'm telling you, every time I say something controversial, I'll back it up with someone more religious than I am. So the Shadal was a student of Paleo-Hebrew. He was a student of the Hebrew language. He was very popular at that time. One of the famous Hebrew grammars, Gesenius's grammar. He was a German living around that time too. Archaeology was picking up new things. People got obsessed with all of these things. The Shadal, Samuel David Lozado, he studied these ancient scripts, and he noticed that these two letters at one time looked very, very similar. And he knows, as a rabbi, he knows that this phrase is very, very hard to translate. It's in a weird place. And he realized if you switch that letter, which now the two can't be confused, right? So now if I were to say this and you only knew the Hebrew fonts that we're used to, you'd be like, I don't know where he's pulling this out of, right? But if you know what they used to look like, you start to notice, absolutely, that's how that should read, right? It talks about the chariot. It talks about the winged angels in Ezekiel. It talks about this rushing sound as berom kevod Adonai minkomo, right? As God's presence, as God's chariot lifted off of the ground. Okay. Next week, maybe I'll start with that, or you know what I'll probably do is at the end of this session, I'll find it, I'll record it, I'll just post it on Facebook to break it down clearly. But this is really, really important to note. The important thing to note is that Hebrew has always been changing, and in ways that we aren't necessarily aware. We're not always aware of the shifts in Hebrew. And so when we learn Hebrew in school or whatever, and you ask why, you're going to get an unsatisfactory answer. You're going to get, that's the way that it is, right? That's just the way it is. For me, I always found that frustrating. I always found it frustrating to say, why are these words, why is their meaning totally different when to me they sound the same, right? And again, it's that idea that the letters changed in their vocalization. They changed in the way that they sound. The vowels changed in the way that they sound. Word structures, biblical words were corrupted basically by different scribal errors, as well as changes in script. So we see that these scripts, these fonts, existed side by side at many times. It's not so clean, right? So the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'll pull an image for this next time. The Dead Sea Scrolls some of them use the Paleo-Hebrew fonts, the Old Hebrew font, whenever they write God's name. They switch fonts when they write God's name. It seems to be like a scribal tradition for like a name of God to be in like the old font, right? And so you see that these fonts existed together side by side. People used to know this stuff. At a certain point, it was lost. So Hebrew has developed over time. I just want to close. Next week, we'll pick up with where I should have gotten to had I been better at time management, which is roots. One of the core principles of Hebrew and what makes it such a beautiful and logical language is what we call a triconsonantal root. These three consonants, these three letters that make up the root of a word. To some extent, this exists in English, right? Where you take the same consonants and you can change the vowels and you could add prefixes and suffixes and infixes and all that kind of stuff, right? Like to read, I read, the reader, right? You have the same consonants, you change around the vowels. Hebrew works like that. And what that does is it means that you can create infinite words from a very finite set of consonants, from a very finite set of sounds. It also means that your vocabulary can grow exponentially by understanding the core building blocks of a word and then recognizing them as you hear them. Okay, so next week, that's where we're going to start. We're going to pick up, I'll show you a very, very common example, which is the word katav. This is good. It's a good example in Hebrew. It's also a good example in Arabic, but I'm going to show you how to recognize those three-letter roots and why it's so important that the letters that we use are actually distinct, because two letters that nowadays sound the same used to sound distinct and will give a word, and every word that you build off of that, a radically different meaning. And so we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about vowels and the change in vowels. In English, there was like a massive shift in the Middle Ages with vowels. So this is something that happens. I don't want anyone to think that like Hebrew is unique either in its changing or in its stagnation. So just for us to note. So I hope that this was more or less clear, hopefully not super offensive. And I hope that for each of you, there was at least one. I always talk for a long time, so I hope there's one thing that you found valuable, because 90% of it probably won't be, but hopefully you found one thing that was valuable, something that was new. And generally, again, the biggest point is that this makes sense. It's a beautiful language. It's old. It's been revived at multiple points of history. And so there's a really, really cool thing with Hebrew, that it makes logical sense, and it also has a really cool and meticulous structure. So I will see you next week. I will post that video to back up the crazy thing that I just shared. And if you have any questions, just email me. My email address at the temple is Yoni, Y-O-N-I, @sinaidenver.org. Send me questions, things that you want to know more about, things that are confusing, things that you heard an answer for but weren't satisfactory, anything like that. I'll tie it into what we'll do. And again, we're going to talk about next week, we're going to pick up on roots, and then we're also going to talk about syllables and vowels.
Thank you, Yoni.
Cool. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Have a
Yes,
Shabbat
thank
Shalom.
you. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.